Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabina Leonelli. I'm the Deputy Director of the Exeter Center for the Study of the Life Sciences, and I'm very glad to be welcoming you today to the third seminar of Egenis of this academic year. And we're very glad to have with us Professor Leif Isaacsen from the University of Exeter. Leif is the head of digital humanities here at Exeter, and he also leads the strand of research of digital humanities of the Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence here at the university. Now, before we get to Leif's talk, may I just remind everybody that we are recording the talk part of this seminar so that we can then post it on the university website and on our YouTube channel for those of us who cannot attend today at this time. We're not going to be recording the Q&A part of the seminar, which will happen in the second part. So basically, it's the last 45 minutes of today's session. So please feel free to then just take into account that the talk will be recorded, but you can talk freely without being recorded when it's time to ask questions. When it comes to the question session, I will be looking for participants to please raise their hand with the raise hand tool within Zoom, and you find that under the participant list in the Zoom tool. And otherwise, people are welcome to ask questions also through the chat and the Q&A components of Zoom, and I'll be sorting through these questions and then passing them on to Leif as we go. So now, without further ado, Professor Leif Isaacsen on the spaces in between, what geographic data can and cannot tell us about the past. The floor is to you, Leif.
Great, thank you, Sabina, and thank you all for attending. Yeah, it's a shame that there isn't an opportunity to kind of hang out more, but I'm looking forward to the discussion kind of later on. And for those of you who are in Exeter, hopefully there'll be plenty of opportunities in future. So in terms of giving a seminar to this group, obviously I was kind of thinking about the things that I do that relate specifically to data. And data is a curious concept in the humanities. It can be hard to kind of nail down exactly what it is that we mean by data. And obviously, one of the things we are particularly interested in doing is problematizing that notion itself. And to some degree, that's what I'm going to try and do today. And in particular, through two projects, one of which is a very, very long-running project of mine, one somewhat more recent, and both of which entirely by chance are related to the city of Alexandria in Egypt. Although beyond that, I'm not sure kind of like how much connection there is. But because I'm based in the Department of Classics and Ancient History, then both will also have a sort of an ancient Roman component as well. So the first of those is about a text called the Manual for Drawing the World by a guy called Claudius Ptolemy. And then the second one is going to look at numismatic data or coin data. In the first case, I'm going to make a case. I'm going to, I think, is if not quite case closed. Hopefully we'll take you on a bit of a journey that sort of shows some of the perils of treating what appears to be data as though it were such. And then in the second one, I'm going to take you on a journey that I'm still kind of going on, and one that perhaps some of you may have thoughts about, but again, just to kind of highlight and problematize some of the issues of using kind of archaeological data, and in particular, some of the ways in which scale and geographic scale can really change our apparent interpretations of what the data says. So, great. So first of all, the first kind of case study is about Claudius Ptolemy, and in particular, a work of his that's called usually shortened to the geography, which means world drawing. So some of you may be familiar with this particular picture. This is a map or apparently from Ptolemy's geography. So Ptolemy was, for want of a better word, a Greek scientist working in Alexandria around about 150 AD. When I say scientist, what I mean by that is that in that period of time, people are, for the most part, not necessarily specializing in very niche elements of science in the way that we would think about that today. And so it's very difficult to refer to somebody as being specifically a geographer, say, because that might only be one component of their sort of scientific agenda, if you will. And broadly speaking, Claudius Ptolemy is interested not just in the world itself, but how the world fits into the wider cosmic picture. And he's particularly interested in the relationship between celestial phenomena and terrestrial phenomena. And we can think of that really as being very similar to the astrology of today. What is the impact of the planets and the stars on things you find in the world? And to enable him to do that, of course, he needs to know what the world looks like and the shape of the world and where people are within it, because that's the only way that you can calculate where people are when particular stars or planets, for example, are rising. So he writes a book called The Geography, and we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of that in just a moment. But for now, I think it's really also important to say is that it's not really a bestseller when he writes it. It almost vanishes without trace, but it's rediscovered in 1295 in Byzantium. It makes it to Western Europe about a century later. And at that point, it pretty much revolutionizes the geography, world geography, in the way that people understand the geography of the world in a very profound way. To give you an example of just how profound that is, before I move on to that, I should say that there are world maps and there are also regional maps within the geography. Again, we'll kind of come back to those in a moment. But to give you an idea of its importance, apologies for this slightly kind of blurry image, but this map here is the world map produced by Martin Waldseemüller. It was sold for $10 million to the Library of Congress about 10 years ago, I think. It might be a little longer than that now. And it's sometimes referred to as the birth certificate of America. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Can you see my cursor there, Sabina? Is that, if I move that around? On the left-hand side, however, you can see.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. So on the left-hand side, you can see South America, and in fact, this is the first document, the first map that uses the word America. Hence, it's named the Birth Certificate of America. What's interesting to us is that the entire sort of central panel, if you will, is actually lifted almost directly from Ptolemy. So at that period, in around the beginning of 1500. Contemporary European notions of the shape of the world were very, very heavily dependent on Ptolemy's geography, and then that was kind of expanded with information from Marco Polo and other travelers. Okay, so turning now a little bit to the nature of the geography itself. So one of the things that has been for obvious reasons, I guess, gets the most interest is the maps, which have kind of come down to us, and we don't really know whether those were produced by Ptolemy, or copies, obviously, of maps produced by Ptolemy, or whether they were produced from a text. And that's a really important distinction, because the geography is, as the name of a manual for world drawing implies, exactly that. It gives you instructions, so it gives you a set of rules, as well as a large catalog of data to be able to produce a range of different maps. So in principle, you can actually, just with the text alone, produce those world maps, as well as different regional maps at different scales, depending on your need. And in fact, the principles that underlie the construction of the geography are more or less identical to those that we have for geographic information systems. So if you think of a contemporary GIS, essentially what that does is take a series of data sets. It has a bunch of algorithmic rules that can be applied to those data sets, and it can then generate a whole range of different kinds of maps, depending on whatever purpose. So if you think of the way we think about GIS today, the principles behind that are very much 2,000 years old. So one of the other reasons that as a document it hasn't been particularly heavily studied in terms of the text is, as you can see from the example over here, pretty much like reading a telephone directory, right? It's not terribly exciting, compared to readings of Strabo or Pliny, who might kind of have all sorts of interesting anecdotes about the places they're talking about. Here you can see that they're really just lists of places, and then geographic coordinates in terms of latitude and longitude, with a few very kind of brief interludes of descriptions, and typically kind of tribal affiliation names in between them. So it's not, apart from for data nerds, it's not the most exciting of classical text to work your way through. However, it has kind of because of its importance as one of the kind of the foundational works of contemporary geography. People have been really interested in its history. So how was it that it was kind of constructed, and in particular, because it contains thousands of these coordinates, where do they come from, and how reliable are they? How much can we rely on particular positions, both in terms of identifying the location of known cities, as well as being able to, for example, identify the names of archaeological sites where we know the location. And that boils down to a long-standing question of the dependence of Ptolemy on another guy called Marinos of Tyre. So Tyre is in Levant and the Eastern Mediterranean. The reason for this kind of question is that Ptolemy is rather ambiguous within his own text about just how dependent he is on Marinos. And it seems that he kind of puts quite a lot of emphasis on Marinos's work in his introductory chapters. And that leads to a general question. Is Marinos here really the true unsung hero who is responsible for creating most of this map, and that all Ptolemy has done is kind of tweaked a few things, but because his map is a slightly more recent one, an updated one, and because we don't have Marinos's map, then he's essentially been kind of like, lost to history, if you will? Or is Ptolemy doing something radically different and taking Marinos's works and building on those in a new and original way? So if we look at what Ptolemy has to say about Marinos, there are a number of different quotes that might have some kind of bearing on this. So one thing, as I kind of mentioned, is he mentions that Marinos of Tyre is the latest author in our time to have undertaken the subject of geography, and he's done it with absolute diligence. From that, given that Ptolemy is working about 150 AD, it's generally assumed that Marinos is working probably about 100 AD. We've then thus taken on a twofold task. So first, to preserve Marinos's opinions as he expresses them throughout the whole of his compilation, because he makes clear that Marinos doesn't just produce one geographic publication, many of them, except the things that need correction. And second, to see that things he doesn't make clear are inscribed as far as they should be, based on their positions or the more accurate maps. So it's clear that Ptolemy is using Marinos as some kind of a basis. It's clear that he wants to correct some things. It's clear that he wants to add some things. What's much less clear is just how much he wants to correct and just how much he wants to add. Another intriguing little tidbit from the geography is the statement that Marinos did not have time to draw a map. What does that mean in the ancient world? We're kind of presuming that people don't have the same kind of publication deadlines in 100 AD that we might have today. So why would he not kind of go about doing that? Well, we really don't know. But really importantly for us, he also emphasizes that in taking so he's clearly not drawing from a map from Marinos, and he also makes clear that from Marinos's text, there is an important distinction between places on the coast, which tend to have locations, but which are different from those which are inland, because there the relative position with respect to each other is not indicated, so we don't know where they are in relation to each other, with a few exceptions. And sometimes all we get is longitude, that means east-west, and sometimes only latitude. So what he's basically saying here is there isn't a map. Marinos gives us a fair amount of data, it would seem, but most of that seems to be associated with coastlines. And if we look at Ptolemy's coordinates themselves, so here's just from a kind of a GIS kind of dump of all of the kind of coordinates. One of the things that we can see is that Ptolemy is actually quite specific about separating out his data. He actually does this region by region, but he always starts by looking at kind of boundaries and coastlines. He then moves on to talk about geographic features like mountains and rivers. Then he'll move on into a separate section talking about settlements. And then finally, he'll discuss islands. So what's really curious, however, given his statement about the difficulty of identifying or the lack, if you will, of kind of spatial coordinates for internal cities, is that Ptolemy's coordinates are radically different from all of our evidence for people, for his predecessors, who are giving us any kind of spatial information for particular places. So here we've kind of drawn from 4 separate authors that we know of, all of whom have provided some kind of latitudinal, longitudinal information for a number of places. And without going to Eratosthenes, Pliny, Hipparchus, and Marinos here just being drawn from the Ptolemaic text. We can't really kind of compare the number of places they refer to, because in many of these cases, particularly Eratosthenes, Hipparchus, and Marinos, all we have is fragmentary material. Okay, we don't actually have the original text themselves. So it may be that all we've got is, what we're doing is kind of peering through the keyhole, if you will, and just seeing a kind of like a handful of the places that they give coordinates for. Nonetheless, what's really clear for all 4 of those is that Ptolemy's statement about locations being, generally assigned to places on the coast is exactly right. Okay, in all 3 of these cases, you can see that somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of those locations are coastal, and a good chunk of the rest of those are on boundary locations. And comparatively few of those are kind of in the interior, if you will. And then we turn to Ptolemy and we see that the entire thing is entirely flipped, right? So almost 3/4 of Ptolemy's locations seem to be from the interior. And that seems to completely fly in the face of his statement about, his sources of data. So how does that come about? How can we explain Ptolemy providing us with apparently these very black and white kind of coordinates when he expressly sort of states the lack of evidence from predecessors, and from what we know of those predecessors, absolutely kind of bears that claim out. So one of the advantages of working with Ptolemy, or rather, of working with somebody who essentially wrote the foundational work on the technology that you work with, is that GIS is actually really ideally placed in a way to start exploring the data itself, and to start thinking about, we can play around with the data in a way that's much easier than, for example, having to kind of just like read through those long lists of coordinates, which is historically the way that people have tended to approach it. So let's start, in a sense, with a kind of blank map of Ptolemy. So here we have the different regions that Ptolemy kind of outlines in a GIS. I mentioned before that the coordinates are in degrees of latitude and longitude, and those are exactly the same kinds of degrees that we use today. So that's, there's a 360 degrees all the way around the world, and then 90 degrees north and south from the equator to the 2 poles. One of the really curious and interesting things about Ptolemy is that his inhabited, what he calls the inhabited world, is exactly 180 degrees. What's also interesting is that he suggests on the right-hand side, if you look down on the bottom right-hand corner here, you'll see that the Indian Ocean, in Ptolemy's view, is actually an enclosed sea, and the landmass kind of continues to the east. But as far as Ptolemy is concerned, that this is what he calls the inhabited world. To the west, we've got the Atlantic, so we have a water body over here. Although the coordinates themselves are provided in these degrees of latitude and longitude, in the instructions for producing the map, surprisingly, Ptolemy asks us to do something kind of different, and instead to divide east-west. Towards the end of this discussion, I'll kind of come to the north-south divisions, but east-west, he asks the map maker to divide it into what are called hour intervals, and you can think of those as being exactly the same thing as time zones. So again, he's really interested in time for a particular place is measured by when the sun or a particular star rises or passes overhead, called the meridian, or sets in the rises in the east and sets in the west. So because of that interest in time, you divide this into, and because it's 180 degrees, into 12-hour intervals. And again, his proposal is that you divide that again into thirds. So each of these is a kind of 20-minute interval of time. He also, in terms of providing his evidence and talking about how do we know how far east or west the ecumeny, so the inhabited world stretches, he uses evidence from a number of different travelers and who travel from the Mediterranean to the east in different ways, to China and Southeast Asia. And he also talks about the use of a solar eclipse, because a solar eclipse is apparently experienced by people in different parts of the world at different times, although of course in real time it's simultaneous. And one of the curious things about this in some of the examples that he gives, so this where we have a red star here and a red star here, so this is where the same eclipse was observed here in Carthage in North Africa, and another place called Arbela here in the Middle East. And there are exactly 3-hour intervals between those, between the two observations. So essentially, this was seen 3 hours later in Carthage, later than it was seen, 3 hours later in Carthage than it was seen here in Arbela. There are also some other examples where he talks about the distance between the mouth of the river Batiste over here and the source of the Indus, and describes that as being 8-hour intervals. And the thing that I noticed is when I was kind of playing around with this data is that both of these appear to start almost exactly 20 minutes into, in terms of time, rather than starting on an hour interval. And that led me to think about kind of playing not with the data itself, but the framework through which the data is expressed. So if we take that same set of hour intervals, but what we do is move them so that our origin, our first hour interval, starts 20 minutes later. Okay, so this is the beginning of the first hour interval, this is the second hour interval, the third hour interval, and so on. And here divide them rather than into thirds, into halves. Then curiously, what we start to see is that parts of these regions not only are almost exactly an hour interval or half an hour interval or 2/3 of an hour interval in width, but they begin and end at those divisions as well. So you can see this quite nicely with the example of the Italian peninsula, that the mouth of the river Var over here starts exactly on this half-hour interval, and then over the heel of the boot of Italy kind of ends here as well. And we can see also in the division between Sarmatia and Germania, again, a very nice kind of division over here. Again, the mouth of the Rhine and various kind of river mouths and origins as well. And as we look at these different kind of zones, you can see a kind of like quite a snug fit, if you will, where the size of particular regions within the inhabited world doesn't seem to be based in any kind of measurement, right? It's not that somebody has kind of gone out and calculated the distance in miles, but in fact is fit into a fairly arbitrary framework of time. However, although it's quite kind of neat over here, we get these kind of really nice points of conjunction between the boundaries of these regions and our intervals in Europe. In North Africa, it doesn't work quite so well, and this is the same thing here in Central Asia. However, again, with the magic of GIS, we can perform another experiment, and we can take those entire kind of contiguous chunks, and in the case of Asia, we can move it exactly kind of 1 degree. And in the case of North Africa, we can move it by 1.5 degrees. And again, what we find is exactly the same thing kind of transpires, right? So here you can sort of see like a nice, nice boundary lines between these regional divisions, again, meeting really kind of nicely with the boundaries which are kind of created by the hour intervals, and again, the bounds over here. So it's as though Ptolemy has taken a really quite a nice but artificial framework of regions which fit very closely within this hour interval framework, and then for some reason, some unclear reason, has taken all of those locations and moved them 1 degree to the east, 1 degree to the west, and in this case, 1.5 degrees to the east. Another factor I mentioned before is that Ptolemy is quite interested in geographic, physical geography, so mountains and rivers. And another curious aspect of this is that we see that it's the physical geography in particular, rather than the political geography, which seems to fit most nicely within that kind of framework. So again, we mentioned the mouths of those particular rivers, and here we can sort of see in North Africa that where we have these two rivers kind of flowing into the Mediterranean, again, they align really quite closely with these hour intervals. But where we have political geography that isn't divided according to those physical barriers, if you will, then it doesn't seem to kind of fit quite so nicely. So what we're starting to kind of develop here is something that looks a little bit like an Ptolemy, something that provides the basis for Ptolemy's kind of coordinates, but is predominantly associated with boundaries and predominantly associated with the physical world, if you will, and is tied in to time and very kind of broad generalizations that, for example, Italy is 1 hour interval. So that is 1/24 of the world's sort of circumference, if you like, for beginning from east to west. By taking that framework, he's then able to take other kinds of data and plug that in to the different shapes and gaps that overall framework seems to create. There is something also of a smoking gun here, which is one of the reasons why I'm able to kind of be somewhat more kind of confident in that association, that this framework comes from Marinos rather than Ptolemy. And that's because towards the end of Ptolemy's discussion of Marinos, he points out a small list of errors that Marinos appears to have made. And it's entirely unclear why he's so interested in those. So what he usually, the kinds of errors that he usually kind of points out are of the kind of logical dilemma that there are 3 locations, that one is, we have location A, the location B is to the east of that, location C is to the east of location B, but to the west of location A, say, right? So you wind up with some kind of logical inconsistency within Marinos's records. The weird thing about his discussion of those errors is that, given that the map itself is of the entire world and contains literally thousands and thousands of locations, it's unclear why he should list such a small number of these places and get hot under the collar about, and here's a nice example where London is north of Novia Magus by some number of miles that he feels is kind of inappropriate. Why, given the impossibility of doing the task so accurately, should he care about these things? And what we find when we map those sets of inconsistent places is that, by and large, they tend to be associated, again, particularly with these hour interval boundaries. So you can see that happening with London, over here, with the east of the Pyrenees over here, with Ravenna, and so on. It's not the case in every single example, but in most cases we can sort of see a direct association with one of these hour intervals. So it seems that he's particularly kind of concerned because it's precisely in those areas where Marinos's framework doesn't really fit together, right? It's inconsistent. And last of all, as I kind of mentioned, that I kind of talk about latitude and time. So Ptolemy's dealing with north-south divisions is quite different. And here's, rather than divide things into degrees, he instead divides them into what are the lengths of the longest day. So if you imagine at the equator, the days are all the same length, and at the North Pole, we've got sort of 6 months of, 6 months of day, if you like, followed by 6 months of night, as the seasons circle around. And then in between those two extremes, so in Scotland, for example, the nights are longer. The nights are longer in winter, but the days are longer in the summer. And so that gives us an ability to sort of measure latitude by measuring the length of the daytime in midsummer or midwinter. The only problem with that particular approach is that as we kind of move further north, the divisions, but the space between those intervals gets narrower and narrower. So that means that he has to further south divide those intervals into halves or into kind of to quarters, and further on, the further north he goes, the more those he divides it into 12 hours versus 13 hours versus 14 hours versus 15 hours and so on. So over here, you can sort of see that there's no nice, neat, regular way to divide the north-south, but it does give you an approximate kind of, divisions into north and south. The reason that turns out to be quite interesting is it gives us an insight into the way in which he seems to have kind of collated data from a series of different kinds of sources. And we can do that by tracing the sequence in which he lists locations. So one of the really fascinating things about moving from spatial information to textual information is it forces us to serialize. It forces us to choose what's going to come after what else. So in space, we've got 2 dimensions and things can, you can arrange them in a variety of different ways. But in text, you only have a series. You have to choose or have some kind of order imposed upon you. So if we track the locations of the different places and we kind of sketch out paths between them, you can see a couple of nice examples of very different ways in which that's been approached. So in this whole area here in Central Asia, what he essentially does is works along. I don't know if you can sort of see these kind of these thin lines here are degrees, and essentially what he does is work along a band of an interval of 1 degree, starting from the north. So you start here and goes from west to east, and from then down to the next degree, and then from west to east, and then the next degree and west to east, and so on, just in this series of lines. Whereas over here in Germania, he's done exactly the same thing, but using a completely, but instead of using these degree intervals, he's been using these lengths of longest day as the boundaries, if you will, between which he's listing these. So it appears as though his source material, for example, from here, comes from a completely different, presumably some kind of map from the content that he has here. So you get a nice sense of having taken that framework that Marinos has provided that gives us these outlines and boundaries, mountain ranges and rivers, that he's then able to take some kind of regional map and project that into the space and then draw off the individual kind of coordinates, which themselves might be much less precise and might not relate to a place on the surface of the Earth. So because Marinos has given that global framework, he can be sure that the approximate relationship, the approximate distance between something observed over here and something observed over here is still by and large systemically correct. And I think that's one of the kind of the geniuses of Ptolemy, is he's able to take a range of this individually what he calls chorographic or regional mapping in individual data, plug it into a wider framework, and by doing that, minimize the overall systemic error, which would occur if you were just trying to kind of take one not very good map and glue it next to the next map and so on. So it enables us to have a by and large really sort of surprisingly impressive, and I hope you would agree that for 150 AD this is a surprisingly impressive map of the world, even though internally many of these kind of coordinates seem to be kind of profoundly wrong. Okay, so that's the first. So the first project I wanted to talk about, and so now moving on to the second one. So also related to Alexandria, but here we're looking almost 150 years later, and we're going to be looking at the kind of the period right at the end of the 3rd century. So this project came about by almost entirely by chance. So I also, as well as working on Ptolemy, have an excavation up in the north of Scotland in a place called Forres, which you can sort of see is kind of over here. So it's in this area called the Moray Firth. And as part of that excavation, I've been working with a museum called the Faulkner Museum. It's the local museum of the town. And when I was visiting, I noticed in one of the cabinets that there were these 5 coins, these 5 Roman coins. And because I'd been studying the various historical finds from the area, I was aware that I hadn't seen them cited on any list of Roman coins kind of found in the area. So I wanted to know a little bit more about them. Now, unfortunately, we really don't know an awful lot about them at all. The only information that we have comes from the museum record, which says that they came from the Culbin Sands. And the Culbin Sands are an area just to the north of Forres, really kind of right on the coastline here. That in the medieval period were quite wealthy or quite rich farmland, but which were then in the, I'll get this wrong now, 16th century and 17th century, essentially overcome by desertification and sand dunes. So they pulled up a lot of the kind of the marram grass, which kind of held the sand in place, and in doing that, loosened it up and created these really large mobile dunes, which over time overcame the various small settlements and medieval farming landscape which was there. So that lasted for a period of about 200-300 years. It was entirely unoccupied, but became and kind of remains a really important area for archaeological finds. But because the dunes themselves kept moving around, and because a lot of this was taking place in the 18th and 19th century, we actually really had no idea about exactly where in that kind of quite large area of, I think it's about kind of 10-15 square miles, that most of that material kind of comes from. So it's very common. I think the National Museum of Scotland has something like 30,000 odd finds, that stretch from the Neolithic to the medieval, that just say Culbin Sands, and nobody knows exactly where they come from. And this is a nice example of that. We know, well, it's assigned to the Culbin Sands. It was accessioned to the museum in 1981, but that in and of itself may not mean that it was handed in that period. So that's about as much kind of information as I had, but I was interested to find out more about what the coins were and where they came from. So after a bit of numismatic digging and calling in some friends, it turns out that 4 of these coins, the greenish ones here, and these are the ones we're going to mostly be focused on, are Alexandrian tetradrachms or drachms. And that's Roman coinage from Alexandria, which obviously is a very long way to find themselves up in the north of Scotland. This coin here is what's called Roman Republican coinage, or sorry, Roman provincial coinage rather, which is coinage which is minted by a particular city, but not on behalf of, if you will, the imperial state. So yeah, and this one comes from Beirut, also in the eastern Mediterranean. We don't know for sure that they were found together, but obviously the sort of similarity of all of these suggests that they probably have some. Certainly, the 4 Alexandrian coins have some kind of common origin, and the fact that they're all from the eastern Mediterranean suggests that they likewise probably found their way to northern Scotland together in some regard. Okay, so that was obviously kind of an intriguing little mystery about why. In terms of the dating, they were dated. These 3 here, so these 4 here were produced by 2 emperors who were co-rulers. So Diocletian produced 3 of them. So they're minted in the name of Diocletian. Maximian is another of the Roman emperors, and they formed 2 of what were called the Tetrarchy, or 4 Roman emperors who collectively ran the Roman Empire between about 284 and 305 AD. So okay, so these Alexandrian coins turning up in the north of Scotland. What might be the story that could have led to them turning up there? So the first thing that I did was look a little bit into a series of reports produced and published in the Proceedings of the Society of the Antiquaries of Scotland between 1913 and 2010 to see if any other Alexandrian coins had been found in Scotland. And surprisingly enough, it turns out that actually quite a large number had been. So about 70 had been reported, including one over here. So this is kind of Culbin Sands, another kind of down towards the foot of a cliff, just sort of slightly further to the east. A good number of them are found around the footprint, if you will, of kind of modern Glasgow and Edinburgh. A number of them are found here in central Scotland, and surprisingly far inland, and certainly in areas where we don't really expect to find a lot of Romans. And then very curiously around here, very frequently around the coastline. And when I say the coastline, literally, in some cases, we have examples of these coins being found by somebody swimming or or going diving off the coast. Another example of somebody finding one inside of a limpet. So a fisherman who was kind of looking for bait, peeled a limpet off a rock and found one of these kind of coins inside. And we also find them, surprisingly, perhaps, on the island of Islay and the Mull of Kintyre as well. So, and one potentially up here in Lewis. So it's a pretty unusual places for the Roman Empire. So then looking a little bit more into the interpretation of those and when, what was the period in which they might have kind of found their way, to Scotland. And there it turns out that there's been a sort of extensive debate within amongst of Scottish archaeologists and people sort of studying Roman coinage in Scotland about whether these are in fact what are called modern losses. So not coins which were brought to Britain during the ancient period, but in contrast to being brought as kind of collector's items by people in the modern period, which can technically be any period from antiquity on, but much more likely within the past kind of two or three centuries. So that's what's here meant by modern losses. One of the particular reasons for that interpretation for Alexandrian coins is that in the Roman period, Alexandria had a closed economy. So you weren't able, right up, as we'll sort of see, up until the period we've been talking about, 296, 297, you couldn't have spent a coin minted in Egypt elsewhere in the Roman Empire, and vice versa. You couldn't have used a coin minted elsewhere in the empire within Egypt. And Egypt was unique in that regard. Otherwise, Roman coinage produced in Rome was, or in Africa or the Middle East, could be used anywhere else in the empire. So there is genuinely a question about what would be the utility of importing any kind of coin from Egypt to Britain if it essentially had no value. And if we look through these reports, we see a kind of let's go back. We see an oscillation in terms of interpretations by various numismatists. So George MacDonald in 1924, in one of his reports, says that it describes one of an Alexandrian coin that may be one of many that found their way to this country during and after the Great War. Then again in 1933, he says coins of Alexandria undoubtedly found their way into Britain in Roman times. So now he's kind of moving back towards, so some of these things might be genuine, but after the war, many Alexandrian coins were brought home by soldiers who had been in Egypt. And importantly, I had to identify quite a number of their owners. The Stevenson specimen may have been thrown away when it was realized that it was worthless. Then in 1960, a different numismatist has sort of taken over the role of publishing these reports and says it is arguable that the 39 Alexandrian coins all reached Scotland through modern collectors or through tourists or soldier travelers returned from Egypt. But in that case, it is strange that so many modern owners have been so careless about losing their curios. Although it may seem possible or even probable that some of the Alexandrian coins should be set aside as modern losses, they cannot all be so dismissed. So we're sort of seeing with Robertson considerably more ambivalence here. There's maybe some of these things are, have been lost in modern times, but we can't just kind of write them all off, and so we need to, record them. Again, 83 describes both modern losses as ancient and modern as inexplicable. But then Casey, 1984, writes quite a kind of adamant attack on the notion that these Alexandrian coins were lost in antiquity, and he does that by comparing the profile, if you like, the kinds of coins that we find in Scotland from the profile of coins found in Corbridge, which is a Roman town in northern England, and shows that there's a really kind of very different statistical profile of the kinds of coins which are found. And on that basis, he says that the answer, therefore, that they have, it's because they're modern imports. Otherwise we'd be expecting to find these things in Corbridge. We don't. So the only way that we can explain that is that these are just kind of tourist trinkets that have been brought back by travelers to the East in modern times. Bateson, who himself kind of quotes Casey's publication, who takes over from Robertson in terms of these publication of coins, then takes a much more, if you will, kind of skeptical view and says it's generally accepted that the continuing finds of Alexandrian tetradrachms are recent depositions of souvenirs, and in another publication that they are the lost souvenirs of more recent times. So we can see this sort of start. We can see in Scotland that MacDonald in the kind of the early 20th century, is open to some of these things kind of coming over during the Roman period, but is of the view that many of them, or most of them, are are brought over during the First World War. Robertson then in the kind of mid 20th century is much more kind of ambivalent and kind of feels like there's something kind of going on here, but it's hard to explain it both in terms of ancient or modern losses. Casey in 84 makes a kind of a strong argument against it, and then from then on, Bateson kind of takes the line that that, looking at the Scottish coins, we just can't really kind of justify these things as being ancient, or the coins themselves, of course, are ancient, but the deposition patterns being ancient. So in order to kind of explore that a little bit further, the only way to really kind of compare it, and not just kind of compare it to one town of kind of Corbridge, was to look at English data. And of course, most of England was part of the Roman Empire in a way that Scotland was, Scotland in the period that we're talking about was not part of the Roman Empire and was beyond Hadrian's Wall. And what we can see that from the wonderful portable antiquity scheme is we actually find an awful lot of these coins spread out all over England, and again, quite as far south as Cornwall. And curiously, and looking at another area that, of course, was never part of the Roman Empire, in Ireland as well. So we see these things kind of really in kind of quite sort of significant numbers, and occasionally we find them in largest hordes. There's a well-known hoard found in London at Fetters Lane, and another one, not a hoard, but a distribution from a shipwreck, and right by the footprint of an early modern shipwreck. In fact, we have a whole range of these coins as well, and some nice work to try and look at the spatial profile of where those coins were found and try to figure out, did these coins come from that 18th century shipwreck, the HMS Pomone, or was just the case that the HMS Pomone was wrecked on the Needles in the same way that some ancient shipwreck itself was wrecked there a couple of millennia previously. So looking at the kind of distribution there, we can sort of see that we find these things all over the British Isles. And that takes us back to a really kind of nice tie-in with Exeter. So it turns out this debate doesn't start in the beginning of the 20th century, but really begins in earnest with a kind of publication in 1837 of a book called Silva Antica Iscana, that talks about the Roman finds in Exeter. So a guy called Captain Short, who lived in Exeter at the beginning of the 19th century, got really excited when workmen working in various areas, as they were kind of leveling the central streets and opening up a lot of the arches to increasing traffic in central Exeter, started exhuming large quantities of Roman coins, but most importantly, Roman coins that came from the Eastern Mediterranean. And he wrote an article in the first edition of the Numismatic Journal, sort of saying that on the basis of this, that Exeter was this kind of major hub for Mediterranean trade in Britain. That was greeted with very short shrift by the numismatists, who said that this was kind of completely ridiculous, and that he'd been, either fooled or mistaken, or that it was these kind of coins had come from some private collection that had accidentally been dumped, in the street at some point. So in 1907, Haverfield and the same MacDonald we kind of read sort of said that we are dealing here with a modern collection of Eastern Mediterranean coins that are not the result of ancient trade. Then in 1937, in defense of Short, Goodchild and Milnes have said, well, we maybe need to kind of reconsider this, because since that publication, we've started finding them in other places as well. So this is not just Short asking kind of builders what they found, but we now have other examples of these kind of coins kind of turning up. But then in 1991, as part of a kind of an overall synthesis of the Roman archaeology of Exeter, Boone looked at the kind of the patina of not all of these coins, but many of them, and felt that it in no way gave the impression of coins that had originally been lost within Exeter, that had been kind of buried in the ground in Exeter, but was much closer to the kind of coins that you would find, the kind of the patina that would be created lying in the desert in the Middle East. And therefore, in his view, these kind of the material that he saw certainly didn't justify the notion that these coins were ancient losses, but rather they'd been kind of brought to Exeter at some point in the modern period. So again, this is a kind of a nice example of this kind of backwards and forwards between different academics about whether these Eastern Mediterranean kind of coins were deposited in antiquity or in the modern period. The really tricky thing, of course, is that when we focus on just individual examples, then it's always quite easy to kind of argue the toss or the uncertainty. And it's really only by looking at kind of like the larger scale that we can ask for bigger patterns. So, one of the curious things about these kind of coins is that we almost always find them in isolation or with other Egyptian coins, and we very rarely find them together in hoards or kind of collections of Roman coins in general. And that suggests that they're that in whatever way they're being moved around, it's not as part of kind of regular currency. However, on the other hand, we can also see some examples of where even if we're not sort of can't find them in a guaranteed archaeological kind of context. This example here, looking at the southwest corner of Cornwall, so this is kind of Penzance, we've got a number of scatters of Roman coins. These are coins found and reported to the Portable Antiquity Scheme, largely through metal detecting. And one of the curious things is that these red diamonds represent Alexandrian coins, and we can see that in each of these cases, they're found in proximity to other Roman coins. Right? So there's no guarantee that this kind of coin was absolutely for certain deposited at the same time as these other Roman coins. But there is something curious about the fact that we don't find them, for example, in other areas of human habitation where we might expect to find coins which are deposited by people in the kind of, accidentally dropped in the modern period, but that we tend to kind of find them in association with Roman coins. And so the question is, how did these Roman coins get here, and these other Roman coins, and whether they deposited in antiquity or the modern period? So almost penultimate thing to kind of talk about, it turns out that Britain is not the only place, of course, that we find these. And thanks to the work of a number of other scholars, Kalu Almondry, Savio Masura, Sidarovich, and Barr, have been documenting usually kind of country by country rather than kind of geospatially. And so the work I've done is to try and plot these more precisely. But it turns out these things kind of pop up not just in Britain, but all over Europe, and even in some kind of fairly extreme places like Estonia and Russia. And one of the things about this map, so if you look at the purple area here, is the boundary of the Roman Empire, more or less around the kind of the period we'll be talking about kind of 296. And I think there are two different things, two different ways one might want to read a distribution map like this. So one thing is to look at it and to say, what's really odd about these kind of coins is that we don't find them largely within the boundaries of the Roman Empire, right? So we can actually find large numbers of them outside of the Roman Empire, up here in Scotland, in Germany, and in Ireland, with the exception perhaps of kind of the areas around the Northern Alps, over here in Belgium, and over here in northeast Italy. So there are some kind of particular hotspots, but other than that, they seem to be, as a kind of phenomena, much more generally found outside the Roman Empire than inside. On the other hand, I think the notion of modern losses, certainly in terms of tourist trinkets and returning soldiers, just doesn't really work when we look at this kind of wider scale. Right? So if we're talking about the British military in the Napoleonic Wars, well, that might explain a distribution in Britain, but it's certainly not going to explain the kind of the distribution over here in Germany. So I think this is one of the kind of an intriguing questions about why do we find these coins not just in particular areas that we might association with known historical phenomena in Britain, but trying to understand their distribution kind of more generally. Finally, just to look at kind of the temporal distribution instead of just maps. So if we think about the period that we're looking at of these kind of coins, and we look at their temporal distribution, the great majority of them come from the end of the 3rd century, and that suggests, because of the way that kind of coins are kind of aggregate in time, if you looked at, let's say you had kind of 20 coins in your pocket, what you might imagine is that most of those were minted in the past few years, and then there's a smaller number of those were kind of a little bit older, and then you're going to get a long kind of tail distribution with the older and older coins, because coins get taken out of distribution and lost and so forth. So because we see that kind of a similar kind of long tail distribution, sorry, that's not this histogram, but we can see that most of the coins that we find distributed in Britain and in Europe date to around that period of the end of the 3rd century. But it still doesn't, and what complicates matters is that right at the moment, the last kind of, the last dates that we find these coins align with the closure of that mint that was caused by a revolt in Alexandria in 297, when Diocletian famously is up to his horse's knees in blood, defeating the usurper, and subsequently closes down not only the mint, but completely revolutionizes coinage as part of a much wider scheme within the Roman Empire. And we can see that wider scheme kind of play out here. So these categories here are what are called Reese periods, and they break down time throughout the Roman Empire into periods that range from about 15 to 30 years, and are loosely aggregates of particular emperors' reigns. So these are coins found by the Portable Antiquity Scheme. So these are coins from England and Wales. And the thing that I wanted to show you is looking down here, these are the different mints, the proportions of kind of coins and the mints they were produced from. And you can see from this kind of period, from the beginnings really of the kind of the Roman invasion, right up until very kind of close to the period we're talking about, the overwhelming majority of those coins were minted in Rome. And then in the middle of the 3rd century, a period that's known as the 3rd century crisis, Britain, a large part of Gaul and Spain secede from the Roman Empire, and you get mass minting of other coins, leading to this sort of hyperinflation of locally created coinage. They're brought briefly back into the fold, and then again at the end of the 3rd century, Britain secedes alone under a couple of usurpers called Carausius and Electus, and again we get this kind of hyperinflation of really large kind of numbers of coins being produced in Britain and elsewhere. And what's kind of interesting here is that the number of coins that we find from the minted from the Roman Empire in Britain from that period is really very, very small. So the ability, the access to coinage at that particular period, and particularly coinage from Rome, is very low, and that's because of this hyperinflation period of this kind of desperation to pay bring as much kind of coinage together to pay the soldiers as possible. And then we see this huge transformation, not only in the denominations, the kind of coins which are produced, but the places in which that coinage is made. So we can sort of see for the next period, large numbers of coins being minted in London, in Britain, but in particular we see them being now minted in Trier and in Gaul. So in just this period where we have these kind of unusual kind of coins apparently being kind of turning up, or at least apparently, is also very much the kind of the tipping point where the old coinage kind of breaks down effectively, and an entirely new kind of coinage needs to be kind of introduced. So an interesting question is whether these coins are being brought from Egypt following this this kind of revolt as a mechanism for kind of paying troops, and essentially where money is in very, very short, and silver is a very short supply, and this might be a ready source of it to pay for military operations both within the empire and beyond it. I don't know that that's true. It's a working kind of hypothesis, but hopefully what I've sort of shown is that by looking at that data at these very different ranges and scales, you can get very different impressions about whether or not these kind of coins were deposited in antiquity or otherwise. Thanks very much. I hope that I haven't run over my time too much. Yeah, I'll take questions now for sure, but otherwise, I'm very happy to correspond over email. Great, thanks loads.
That's great. Thank you very much, Lee from Azul. And if you want to stop sharing your screen, maybe you're going to also be able to see everybody else in case there are questions.